At 04:45 on July 7, 1944, Lieutenant Colonel William Joseph O'Brien stood in the center of his battalion's defensive line on the Tanipag Plain in northern Saipan, watching 4,500 Japanese soldiers emerge from the darkness 200 yards away. 44 years old, 24 years in the Army, 3 weeks in hell. The Japanese had gathered every soldier capable of walking for the largest bonsai charge in the Pacific War. O'Brien's 1st Battalion, 105th Infantry Regiment, had landed on Saipan's southern beaches on June 16th. The mission was simple: secure the island, put B-29 bombers within striking distance of Tokyo, but the Japanese commander, Lieutenant General Yoshitsugu Seitito, had 31,000 troops waiting. Every cave, every ridge, every yard of volcanic rock was defended. By July 6th, O'Brien's battalion had pushed the Japanese into a narrow pocket on the island's northern tip. His men were exhausted, low on ammunition. The 1st and 2nd battalions had lost 650 men killed or wounded in 3 weeks. 11 rifle companies were down to half strength. Some platoon had 15 men left. O'Brien knew what was coming. Japanese prisoners had warned that Saito was ordering a final suicide attack. Every able-bodied soldier, every walking wounded, even civilians with sharpened bamboo spears. The Japanese called it yokusai, honorable death. The Americans called it a bonsai charge. Either way, it meant the same thing: human wave, no retreat, no surrender. O'Brien's battalion held a thin line 250 yards from the beach. 1st Battalion on the left, 2nd Battalion on the right. A gap existed between them, not enough men to fill it. O'Brien had requested reinforcements. None were available. The entire 27th Infantry Division was stretched thin across the northern plain. The night of July 6th, Japanese soldiers probed the American lines, testing for weak points. O'Brien walked his defensive positions, checked ammunition levels, made sure every foxhole had extra grenades. He told his company commanders to fix bayonets. This wasn't going to be a firefight. This was going to be hand-toned. At 04:30 the probing stopped. Silence settled over the plain. O'Brien stood near his command post, listening. That's when he heard it. Thousands of voices singing, chanting, screaming. The Japanese were working themselves into a frenzied drinking sake, saying prayers, preparing to die. Then came the charge. 4,500 Japanese soldiers poured through the gap between 1st and 2nd battalions. Officers in front waving swords, screaming at the tops of their lungs. Behind them came waves of infantry. Some had rifles. Some had bayonets tied to sticks. Some had rocks. Some had nothing but bare hands. Major Edward McCarthy, commanding 2nd Battalion, said it looked like a cattle stampede from a Western movie, except the cattle kept coming, and they wanted to kill you. O'Brien grabbed the 2 pistols he always carried, Colt 19, 111's 45 caliber. He ran forward into the mass of his men, started firing left hand, right hand, shouting encouragement, telling them to hold the line, not to give up an inch. The Japanese wave crashed into the American positions. Hand-to-hand fighting erupted everywhere. Bayonets, rifle butts, entrenching tools, men wrestling in the dark. The defensive line began to crack. Small pockets of Americans were getting cut off, surrounded. O'Brien kept moving, firing his pistols. A Japanese soldier lunged at him with a sword. O'Brien shot him. Another came from the left. O'Brien dropped him. His presence steadied the men. If their colonel was fighting in the middle of it, they could too. Then O'Brien's pistols ran dry. He grabbed a rifle from a wounded soldier, kept firing. The Japanese kept coming, wave after wave. O'Brien took a round to the shoulder. The impact spun him around, blood soaked through his uniform. His men tried to pull him back. He refused, kept firing the rifle until it too ran empty. That's when O'Brien saw the Jeep. If you want to see what O'Brien did with that Jeep, please hit that like button. It helps us share more stories like this one, and please subscribe if you haven't already. Back to O'Brien. 50 yards behind the front line sat a Willys Jeep. Mounted on the back was an M2 Browning .50 caliber machine gun. The gunner was dead, slumped over the weapon. O'Brien ran to it, pushed the body aside, grabbed the charging handle, racked it back. The bolt slammed forward. He squeezed the trigger. The gun roared to life. O'Brien stood upright in the back of that jeep, fully exposed. No cover, no protection. The .50 caliber bucked in his hands. 550 rounds per minute. Every fifth round a tracer. He swept the gun across the mass of Japanese soldiers charging his position. Men fell in rows, but the Japanese didn't stop. They kept coming straight at the jeep, straight at O'Brien, and he had no idea if he had enough ammunition to stop them all. The M2 Browning was never designed for a jeep. The weapon weighed 84 lb. The recoil shook the entire vehicle with every burst, but O'Brien didn't care. He stood in that open jeep and poured fire into the charging Japanese forces. The .50 caliber round was devastating. It had been designed near the end of World War I to pierce aircraft armor. Against human targets, the effect was catastrophic. A single round could pass through 3 men. The heavy bullets tore through bone and tissue. Japanese soldiers charging in tight formations gave O'Brien perfect targets. He fired in short bursts, 3 to 5 rounds, swept left, swept right. The tracers drew bright lines through the darkness. Every fifth round glowed red-orange. O'Brien used them to adjust his aim. He could see the impacts, see men falling. But for every man who fell, 3 more took his place. The Japanese charge had split into multiple waves. The first wave hit the gap between 1st and 2nd battalions. Thousands of soldiers pushing through. The second wave was hitting the flanks, trying to roll up the American positions from both sides. The third wave was moving toward the artillery batteries, positioned 500 yards behind the infantry line. O'Brien's position gave him a clear field of fire across the gap. He concentrated on the soldiers pouring through. The jeep sat on slightly elevated ground. He could see over the heads of his own men, could track the mass of Japanese infantry pushing forward. His wounded shoulder burned. Blood ran down his arm, made the machine gun grip slippery, but O'Brien kept firing. The adrenaline overrode the pain. He had one job: stop this charge or his entire battalion would be overrun. American soldiers in the foxholes below watched their colonel standing fully exposed in that jeep. Japanese bullets snapped past him. Mortar rounds exploded nearby. Shrapnel pinged off the jeep's metal body. O'Brien never flinched, never ducked, just kept firing. The sound was deafening. The M2 had a distinct hammering rhythm. Boom, 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 boom. 550 rounds per minute translated to 9 rounds per second. The barrel began to glow red from the heat. The ammunition cans mounted on the jeep held 400 rounds total. O'Brien was burning through them fast. Around O'Brien's position, the battle had devolved into chaos. American soldiers were fighting with everything they had: rifles, bayonets, entrenching tools, rocks. Some positions reported Japanese soldiers armed only with sharpened bamboo spears. Others faced enemy troops swinging samurai swords. Private Thomas Baker, positioned in Company A, about 200 yards from O'Brien, was delivering devastating fire with his M1 Garand. Baker was 29 years old, a former factory worker from Troy, New York, same hometown as O'Brien. He'd already distinguished himself earlier in the campaign by single-handedly destroying a Japanese strong point. Now, he was cutting down attackers as fast as he could pull the trigger, but the sheer weight of numbers was overwhelming. Japanese soldiers were breaking through the American lines in multiple places. Small groups of defenders were being isolated, cut off. The defensive line was fragmenting into desperate pockets of resistance. 500 yards behind O'Brien, the 3rd Battalion 10th Marines Artillery Battery was taking direct hits from the charge. Japanese soldiers had punched through the infantry line and were now attacking the howitzers. The gun crews abandoned their artillery pieces and fought with rifles and pistols. Some used the artillery themselves, firing canister rounds point-blank into the mass of attackers. Each canister shell contained hundreds of steel balls like a giant shotgun. The effect at close range was horrific. O'Brien changed ammunition cans. His hands moved automatically, release the empty, snap in the fresh belt, charge the weapon, resume firing. He'd done this hundreds of times in training. Now he was doing it under combat conditions while standing in an exposed jeep with a wounded shoulder. The sky was beginning to lighten. Dawn was approaching. O'Brien could see better now, could see the full scale of what was happening. Thousands of Japanese bodies littered the ground in front of the American positions, but thousands more were still coming. The charge showed no signs of stopping. Then O'Brien's jeep, mounted machine gun, jammed. The bolt locked open. The barrel was too hot. The weapon had overheated. O'Brien slapped the charging handle. Nothing. The gun was done, and the Japanese were less than 50 yards away from his position, closing fast, screaming, waving swords and bayonets. O'Brien stood in that jeep with a useless machine gun, his wounded shoulder throbbing, his battalion fragmenting, and 4-0 Japanese soldiers still attacking. He had seconds to make a decision: abandon the jeep and fall back, or find another weapon and keep fighting. O'Brien didn't abandon the jeep. He grabbed the charging handle again, yanked it back hard. The hot metal burned his palm. The bolt stayed locked. The barrel was glowing cherry red. 500 rounds in less than 10 minutes had overheated the weapon beyond its operational limits. The M2 Browning had a design flaw. Unlike water-cooled machine guns, the air-cooled barrel could only sustain so much continuous fire before the metal expanded and the weapon seized. Standard doctrine called for firing in short bursts with cooling pauses. O'Brien hadn't had time for cooling pauses. He looked at the barrel. Steam rose from the metal. The weapon needed at least 5 minutes to cool. O'Brien didn't have 5 minutes. He had maybe 30 seconds before the Japanese reached the jeep. Around him the battle raged. American soldiers were fighting hand-to-hand in their foxholes. Rifle butts cracking skulls, bayonets thrust into bodies, men grappling in the dirt. The noise was overwhelming. Screaming, gunfire, explosions, the metallic smell of blood mixed with cordite smoke. O'Brien made a decision. He couldn't fix the gun, but he could keep fighting. He jumped down from the jeep. His boots hit the ground hard. The impact sent pain shooting through his wounded shoulder. He ignored it, scanned for a weapon. Any weapon. 20 ft away lay a dead American soldier, an M1 Gare, and rifle beside him. O'Brien ran to it, scooped up the rifle, checked the magazine. 3 rounds left, better than nothing. He fired all 3 into the nearest Japanese soldiers, dropped the empty Garand, looked for another weapon. The ground was littered with dead and wounded from both sides. Rifles, pistols, grenades. O'Brien grabbed a carbine from another fallen soldier. This one had a full magazine, 15 rounds. He started firing methodical, aimed shots. He'd been trained as an infantryman decades ago. The skills came back automatically, but O'Brien wasn't just fighting. He was rallying his men. His presence on the line made a difference. Soldiers who saw their colonel standing upright, wounded, still firing, found their own courage. They stopped thinking about falling back, started thinking about holding ground. Sergeant John Breen, fighting in a foxhole 30 yards from O'Brien, later said he saw his colonel moving through the chaos like he was invincible, taking weapons from the dead, firing, moving, finding more ammunition, never stopping, never retreating. The battle had been raging for over an hour. The initial Japanese wave had punched through in multiple places, but now the momentum was shifting. The American defenders were adapting. Artillery batteries that hadn't been overrun were firing over open sights, canister rounds, high explosive, anything they had. Marines from reserve positions were counterattacking from the flanks, but the center of the line, where O'Brien's battalion fought, was still under massive pressure. Japanese soldiers kept coming. The charge wasn't stopping. It was a suicide attack in the truest sense. The attackers knew they were going to die. They just wanted to take as many Americans with them as possible. O'Brien's carbine ran dry. He dropped it, picked up a Thompson submachine gun. The weapon was heavier than the carbine, .45 caliber, same round as his pistols, 20-round stick magazine. O'Brien fired in controlled bursts. The Thompson's rate of fire was lower than the .50 caliber, but it was devastating at close range. Around him, other soldiers were doing the same thing, fighting with whatever they could find. The defensive line had become a collection of individual fights, small groups of Americans surrounded by Japanese attackers. No organized formations, just survival. 200 yards to O'Brien's right, Private Baker was still fighting. He'd been wounded, a bullet to the leg, but Baker refused to leave his position. He sat in his foxhole, firing his Grand methodically. Every shot counted. Every shot dropped an attacker. Baker's position had become an anchor point for Company A. As long as he was firing, the men around him kept fighting. 500 yards behind O'Brien, Captain Benjamin Salomon, the battalion dentist, was facing his own crisis. Salomon had volunteered to run the aid station when the battalion surgeon was wounded. Now that aid station was being overrun. Japanese soldiers were killing the wounded Americans lying on stretchers. Salomon fought back. He killed 4 Japanese soldiers with his bare hands and a scalpel, then grabbed an M1 rifle and started firing. But the situation was hopeless. Too many Japanese, too few defenders. Salomon ordered the wounded who could walk to evacuate. Then he grabbed a machine gun. Back on the line, O'Brien's Thompson ran empty. He looked around for more weapons, more ammunition, but he was running out of options. The Japanese were pressing from 3 sides now. His position was becoming untenable and the sun was fully up. He could see the entire battlefield, see how desperate the situation really was. O'Brien saw something that made him move. The Jeep, the .50 caliber. The barrel had been cooling for several minutes. Maybe enough. Maybe the gun would fire again. If it would, he could stop this wave. If it wouldn't, he was out of options. O'Brien ran back to the Jeep, his legs burned, his shoulders screamed. Blood loss was making him lated, but he climbed back into that exposed position, grabbed the charging handle of the .50 caliber, pulled it back. The bolt moved sluggish, but it moved. The barrel had cooled enough, barely. O'Brien chambered around, aimed at the mass of Japanese soldiers 50 yards away, squeezed the trigger, the gun fired. 1 round, 2 rounds, 3 rounds. Then it jammed again. O'Brien cursed, slapped the charging handle. The bolt wouldn't move. The barrel was still too hot. The weapon needed more time he didn't have. Japanese soldiers were closing in 40 yards now. He could see their faces, see the determination, the willingness to die. He had no choice. O'Brien jumped down from the Jeep again, looked for any weapon he could find, saw a pile of grenades near destroyed foxhole, grabbed 3, pulled the pin on the first one, threw it into the advancing mass. The explosion scattered bodies. He threw the second grenade, then the third. Each explosion bought him precious seconds. The sun was fully up now. O'Brien could see the full scale of the carnage. Japanese bodies covered the ground in front of the American positions. Hundreds of them piled 3 and 4 deep in some places. But the attack wasn't stopping. More Japanese soldiers were climbing over their own dead to reach the American line. American casualties were mounting too. 1st Battalion had started the night with approximately 800 men. O'Brien could see that number dropping by the minute. Foxholes that had held 3 soldiers now held 1. Some positions were empty, overrun. The soldiers either dead or forced to fall back. Major McCarthy's 2nd Battalion was in similar condition. The gap between the 2 battalions had become a killing field. Bodies from both sides littered the ground. The Japanese had exploited that gap perfectly. Thousands had poured through. Now they were behind the front line, attacking from multiple directions. O'Brien grabbed another rifle, started firing. He was operating on instinct now. Training, experience. 24 years in the Army, all of it distilled into this moment. Pick up weapon, fire, drop weapon, find another, keep moving, keep fighting. 200 YDOA, Private Baker's situation had become critical. He'd been wounded again, this time in the arm. Blood soaked his uniform. His foxhole was surrounded. Japanese soldiers were closing in from 3 sides. Baker's rifle was empty. No more ammunition. The men who'd been fighting beside him were dead or had fallen back. A soldier tried to pull Baker from the foxhole, tried to evacuate him, but Baker refused. He knew he was too badly wounded to move fast, knew he would slow down anyone trying to carry him, knew he would get them killed. Baker made a request: leave him propped against a tree, give him a pistol, a Colt 1911, 8 rounds in the magazine. The soldier hesitated, then nodded, did as Baker asked, positioned him facing the enemy, handed him the loaded pistol, then ran. Baker waited. Japanese soldiers approached. He let them get close, then started firing. 1 round, 1 target. He made every shot count. 500 yards behind the front line, Captain Solomon had mounted a Browning .30 caliber machine gun. The aid station was completely overrun. The wounded had evacuated. Solomon was alone, but he wasn't leaving. He positioned the machine gun to cover the route the wounded had taken, started firing at the Japanese soldiers pursuing them. Solomon fired continuously. The .30 caliber didn't have the range or power of O'Brien's .50 caliber, but at close range it was lethal. Japanese soldiers fell in waves, but they kept coming. Solomon moved the gun, found better position, kept firing. He moved it 3 more times, always finding better fields of fire, always covering the retreat of the wounded. Back on the main line, O'Brien returned to the jeep. The .50 caliber had been cooling for another 5 minutes. He had to try again, had to get that weapon working. It was the only thing with enough firepower to stop this charge. He climbed into the jeep, grabbed the charging handle, pulled it back. The bolt moved smoothly this time. The barrel had cooled enough. O'Brien chambered around, aimed, fired. The gun roared to life. The familiar hammering rhythm filled his ears. O'Brien stood upright again, fully exposed. The same position that had drawn fire earlier. He didn't care. He swept the gun across the Japanese forces, cut down entire ranks. But something was different now. The Japanese charge was beginning to falter, not stopping but slowing. The momentum was gone. Too many casualties, too much firepower. The human wave was breaking apart. American reinforcements were arriving, Marines from reserve positions. Artillery crews who'd abandoned their guns and were fighting as infantry. Tank destroyers rolling up from the beach. The tide was turning. O'Brien kept firing. The .50 caliber bucked in his hands. Japanese soldiers were now less than 30 yards away, close enough to throw grenades, close enough to charge with bayonets, and O'Brien had no idea if his ammunition would last long enough to stop them before they reached his position. O'Brien's ammunition belt was running low. He could see the end of it feeding into the gun. Maybe 50 rounds left, maybe less. The Japanese were 25 D away now, close enough that he could see their expressions, the rage, the determination, the acceptance of death. He kept firing, short, controlled bursts, making every round count. The .50 caliber rounds tore through the advancing soldiers, but for every man who fell, another stepped over the body. The charge was losing momentum, but it wasn't stopping. The jeep's suspension creaked under the recoil. The vehicle was never designed for this. Jeeps were reconnaissance vehicles, light transport. The M2 Browning weighed more than the entire jeep's rated cargo capacity. Every burst pushed the vehicle backward slightly, dug the tires deeper into the volcanic soil. O'Brien's wounded shoulder was beyond pain now. Nerve damage, blood loss. Adrenaline was the only thing keeping him upright. His vision was narrowing. Tunnel vision, a sign of shock. But his hands stayed steady on the machine gun grips around him. The American defensive line was holding barely. Reinforcements from the 4th Marine Division had arrived on the right flank, fresh troops with full ammunition. They were pushing back against the Japanese penetration, closing the gaps, re-establishing the line. Tank destroyers were rolling up from the beach, M10 Wolverines, 76 mm guns. They positioned themselves behind the infantry line and started firing high-explosive rounds into the remaining Japanese forces. Each shell killed dozens. The explosions threw bodies into the air, but the center of the line where O'Brien stood was still under direct assault. The Japanese had concentrated their final push there. Hundreds of soldiers were charging straight at his position, straight at that jeep-mounted .50 caliber. O'Brien's ammunition ran out. The bolt locked back on an empty chamber. The gun was silent. No more belts. No more rounds. He'd fired approximately 800 rounds in the last 20 minutes. The barrel was glowing red again. Smoke rose from the weapon. Japanese soldiers were 15 yards away, charging, screaming. Officers with swords leading the way. O'Brien looked down at the jeep, saw a rifle lying on the passenger seat, grabbed it, jumped down from his exposed position, started firing from behind the jeep's minimal cover. The rifle gave him another 8 rounds. He fired them all, dropped 8 more attackers. Then the rifle was empty. O'Brien threw it aside, looked for another weapon, found a bayonet lying in the dirt, picked it up. The Japanese were 10 yards away now. Around O'Brien, American soldiers saw what was happening, saw their colonel preparing to fight with a bayonet against hundreds of enemy troops. Several men started moving toward him, trying to reach his position, trying to help, but they were cut off, surrounded by their own fights. O'Brien stood there with that bayonet, his back to the jeep, blood soaking through his uniform, his shoulder useless, but he was still standing, still fighting, and he was still shouting at his men. His voice carried across the battlefield even now, the same message he'd been giving all night. Hold the line. Don't give them a damn inch. The Japanese soldiers reached him, swords flashing in the morning sun. O'Brien fought back. The bayonet was short, designed for close quarters. He used it. Thrust, parry, block. The movements were automatic, training from decades ago. But he was wounded, exhausted, losing blood. More Japanese soldiers surrounded the jeep. O'Brien was fighting 3, then 5, then 10. He couldn't hold them all off. The mathematics were simple. 1 wounded man against hundreds. The outcome was inevitable. Sergeant Breen, fighting from his foxhole, saw the moment O'Brien went down, saw the mass of Japanese soldiers around the jeep, saw the swords falling. Then the mass moved on, continuing their charge, leaving O'Brien behind. The battle raged for another 10 hours. The Japanese charge finally broke around noon. American forces had killed or wounded most of the attackers. The survivors retreated into the hills. Some committed suicide rather than surrender. Others fought until they were killed. By 1,800 hours, the Tannapag Plain was secure. The Butcher's Bill was catastrophic. 1st and 2nd Battalions of the 105th Infantry Regiment had nearly been wiped out. 406 killed, 512 wounded. Out of approximately 600 men who'd started the battle, less than 700 were still combat effective. Japanese casualties were even worse. 311 confirmed dead in front of the 105 THS positions. The largest bonsai charge in Pacific War history had failed, but it had come close, very close. If the American line had broken, if the artillery had been overrun, if the reinforcements had arrived 5 minutes later, the outcome could have been different. When American soldiers cleared the battlefield the next morning, they found O'Brien's body. He was still near the jeep, surrounded by 30 dead Japanese soldiers. The bayonet was still in his hand. His eyes were open, facing the enemy. Even in death, Lieutenant Colonel William Joseph O'Brien hadn't retreated. Private Thomas Baker never left that tree. When American forces retook his position later that day, they found him slumped against the trunk. The pistol was empty. 8 dead Japanese soldiers lay in a semicircle around him. Baker had fired every round, made every shot count, just like he'd promised. Captain Benjamin Solomon's body was found at his machine gun position. He'd been hit 76 times, bullets, bayonets, sword wounds, but Solomon had moved that machine gun 4 times during the battle, always finding better fields of fire, always covering the retreat of the wounded. When they found him, 98 dead Japanese soldiers were piled in front of his position. 3 men, 3 different positions, 3 different weapons. All 3 had made the same choice: stand and fight. Buy time for their comrades, accept death rather than retreat. O'Brien with his .50 caliber and bayonet, Baker with his 8-round pistol, Solomon with his machine gun, all three from the same division, all three fighting in the same battle, all three giving everything. The Battle of Saipan ended 2 days later on July 9th. The island was declared secure, but the horror didn't end there. In the days that followed, Marines and soldiers watched helplessly as hundreds of Japanese civilians committed mass suicide. They jumped from the northern cliffs rather than surrender to American forces. Japanese propaganda had convinced them the Americans would torture and kill them. Mothers threw their children off the cliffs, then jumped themselves. The strategic impact of Saipan was immediate. The island put Tokyo within range of B-29 bombers. Long-range strategic bombing could now reach the Japanese homeland. The loss was so catastrophic for Japan that Prime Minister Hideki Tojo resigned. The Japanese government understood what Saipan meant. The war was lost, but the cost had been staggering. American forces suffered nearly 3,000 killed and over 10,000 wounded. The 27th Infantry Division, which bore the brunt of the Banzai Charge, lost almost a third of its strength. Some rifle companies ceased to exist as functioning units. The division spent the next 9 months rebuilding before it was committed to combat again at Okinawa. Japanese casualties were apocalyptic. 29,000 defenders killed, nearly the entire garrison. Only a few hundred survived. Captain Sakai Oba, who had led part of the Banzai Charge, escaped into Saipan's interior with 46 soldiers and protected 160 Japanese civilians. Oba conducted guerrilla operations for 16 more months. He finally surrendered on December 1, 1945, 4 months after Japan's official surrender. The Medal of Honor nominations were filed immediately after the battle. O'Brien's citation documented everything. His actions on June 20th, directing tanks under fire, June 28th, leading the assault on a defended ridge, July 7th, refusing evacuation when wounded and manning that jeep, mounted machine gun until killed. But the award process took time. The war was still raging. Forms had to be completed. Witnesses had to provide statements. The chain of command had to review and approve. O'Brien's widow waited. His son waited. The men who'd fought beside him waited. May 27, 1945, Renelier Polytechnic Institute in Troy, New York. Under Secretary of War Robert Patterson presented the Medal of Honor to O'Brien's widow. The ceremony was held in O'Brien's hometown, the place where he'd grown up, where he joined the National Guard at age 18 during World War I, where he'd spent 24 years preparing for one moment on a volcanic island 7 zeros, 0 mile away. Private Baker received the Medal of Honor posthumously at the same ceremony. His family accepted it. The citation detailed his actions, refusing evacuation when wounded, fighting until his ammunition was exhausted, making his last stand with 8 bullets. Captain Solomon was recommended for the Medal of Honor, but the Army rejected the nomination. Solomon was a medical officer, a dentist. Medical personnel were considered non-combatants under the Geneva Convention. The rule said medical officers couldn't receive combat awards, even if they'd killed 98 enemy soldiers while protecting wounded men. Solomon's case remained in bureaucratic limbo for 58 years. Veterans who'd witnessed his actions campaigned for the award, submitted new evidence, filed appeals. Finally, in May 2002, President George W. Bush presented the Medal of Honor to Solomon's family, 58 years late, but finally recognized. 3 men, 3 medals of honor, same unit, same day, same battle. That had never happened before in American military history, and it never happened again. In November 2009, Troy, New York, erected a memorial to O'Brien at the Renalier County Office Building. It honors him alongside 2 other Troy natives, Major General Ogden Ross and Sergeant Thomas Baker. All 3 had served in the 105th Infantry Regiment. All 3 had fought on Saipan. The memorial includes replicas of the Medals of Honor awarded to O'Brien and Baker, but the real memorial is simpler. It's the men who survived, the soldiers O'Brien bought time for, the wounded Solomon protected, the positions Baker held. Every man who lived because 3 men stood and fought. That's the real memorial. The tactical analysis of the July 7th Bonds. I charge began immediately. Military intelligence officers studied what had worked and what had failed. Why had the Japanese charge come so close to succeeding? Why had it ultimately failed? The answers would shape American defensive doctrine for the rest of the Pacific War. The first lesson was obvious. Machine guns stopped Bonsai charges, but not just any machine gun. The 50 caliber Browning M2 proved decisive. Its range, power, and rate of fire created killing zones that even fanatical attackers couldn't cross. The smaller 30 caliber machine guns were effective, but lacked the stopping power. A 50 caliber round hitting center mass dropped a man instantly. A 30 caliber required multiple hits. O'Brien's Jeep-mounted 50 caliber had been improvised. Jeeps weren't supposed to mount heavy machine guns. The M31 pedestal mount was designed for 30 caliber weapons. Some units had modified them to accept 50 caliber guns, but it wasn't standard. The recoil was too much for the light vehicle. The weapon was too heavy. But when you needed maximum firepower and didn't have a tank, a Jeep mounted 50 caliber was better than nothing. The Marine Corps took note. After Saipan, they standardized Jeep-mounted heavy machine guns for defensive positions. The vehicles were positioned behind the front line with clear fields of fire. When Bonsai charges came, the Jeeps provided mobile firepower that could shift to threatened sectors. The tactic saved lives at Uema and Okinawa. The second lesson was leadership. O'Brien's presence on the line had tangible effects. Soldiers fought harder when they saw their commander sharing the same risks. The data proved it. Positions near O'Brien held longer than positions where officers had stayed in command posts. Men who saw their colonel firing a 50 caliber from an exposed Jeep didn't think about retreating. They thought about holding ground. The Army adjusted its doctrine. Junior officers and senior NCO were instructed to be visible during defensive actions. Not recklessly exposed like O'Brien, but visible where their men could see them. Studies showed that small unit cohesion during Japanese night attacks correlated directly with leadership visibility. The third lesson was ammunition management. O'Brien had fired approximately 800 rounds through that 50 caliber in 20 minutes. That was excessive by doctrine standards. The M2 was designed for sustained fire of 40 to 50 rounds per minute. O'Brien had been firing nearly 5 times that rate. The weapon had overheated twice, had jammed repeatedly, but it had also stopped a human wave attack. The Army revised its ammunition allocations for defensive positions. More 50 caliber ammunition per gun. Extra barrels for quick changes when weapons overheated. Better supply chains to keep ammunition flowing to the front during extended battles. Saipan proved that in extreme circumstances, excessive fire was better than insufficient fire. The fourth lesson was gap defense. The Japanese had exploited the gap between 1st and 2nd battalions perfectly. O'Brien had requested reinforcements to fill it. None were available. The gap became the penetration point for 4-0 attackers. After Saipan, the 27th Infantry Division never left gaps in its defensive lines. If they didn't have enough men to fill a sector, they repositioned to shorten the line. Better to defend less ground with a solid line than more ground with gaps. The Bonds, I charge as a tactic, essentially died at Saipan. The Japanese military command understood the mathematics. 4-0 attackers, 4-300 dead, less than 200 Americans killed in exchange. The exchange ratio was catastrophic. Bonds, I charges accomplished nothing except hastening defeat. But individual Japanese units still attempted smaller charges throughout the rest of the war. At Peleliu, at Uema, at Okinawa, none approached the scale of Saipan. None succeeded in breaking American lines. The defenders had learned. Machine guns, leadership, ammunition, no gaps. The lessons from Tanipag Plain were applied across the Pacific. O'Brien's actions became case studies at the infantry school at Fort Benning. His decision to mount the Jeep, his refusal to retreat when wounded, his continued fighting with multiple weapons. Future officers studied his choices, debated whether he should have stayed on the Jeep or fallen back, whether the risk was justified, whether one man's courage could change the outcome of a battle. The answer was complicated. O'Brien had died. His death hadn't stopped the charge by itself, but his actions had bought time, had steadied his men, had killed dozens of attackers. The cumulative effect of his sacrifice combined with Baker's stand and Solomon's defense had prevented a complete breakthrough. 3 men, 3 positions, 3 different moments where the line could have collapsed, but didn't. Saipan changed the Pacific War, not just strategically with the B-29 bases, but tactically. The Americans learned how to defend against suicidal attacks. The Japanese learned that suicidal attacks failed against prepared defenses. The mathematics of attrition favored the side with more machine guns and more ammunition. And at Saipan, one colonel with a Jeep mounted .50 caliber had proven just how decisive machine gun fire could be against human wave tactics. Lieutenant Colonel William Joseph O'Brien was buried with full military honors at St. Peter's Cemetery in Troy, New York. The funeral procession stretched for blocks. Veterans from World War I marched alongside soldiers who'd fought on Saipan. The city of Troy shut down for the day. Every business closed. Every flag flew at half-mast. O'Brien had been one of their own, a local boy who had spent his entire adult life preparing for one moment of supreme sacrifice. His widow received the Medal of Honor on his behalf. His son, William Jr., stood beside her during the ceremony. The boy was 10 years old enough to understand that his father wasn't coming home, old enough to understand what the medal meant, that his father had died a hero, but young enough to wish his father was just coming home instead. The 105th Infantry Regiment rebuilt. New replacements arrived. New officers took command. But the men who'd survived SAPE and never forgot what happened on Tannipag Plain. They'd seen their colonel standing in that jeep, seen him refuse to retreat when wounded, seen him fight with pistols and rifles and a bayonet, seen him die rather than give ground. Sergeant John Breen, who'd fought 30 yards from O'Brien's position, said it simply. Obi was one of the boys that day. He died right on the front line with us. That was the highest compliment an enlisted man could give an officer. Not that he led well, not that he gave good orders, but that he was one of them, that he fought beside them, that he died with them. The Willys Jeep that O'Brien used was never recovered. It was either destroyed in subsequent fighting or abandoned as scrap metal after the battle. But the M2 Browning .50 caliber machine gun became legendary. That particular weapon was supposedly recovered and sent to the Ordnance Museum at Aberdeen Proving Ground, but the records are unclear. Thousands of .50 caliber Brownings served in World War II. Tracking one specific weapon through the chaos of the Pacific War was nearly impossible. What matters isn't the physical weapon, it's what O'Brien did with it. He stood in an exposed jeep and fired 800 rounds in 20 minutes, killed dozens of enemy soldiers, bought precious time for his battalion, proved that courage and firepower could stop even the largest bonsai charge in history. The Patent Museum at Fort Knox has exhibits on the 27th Infantry Division, photographs from Saipan, weapons used during the battle, the Medal of Honor citations for O'Brien, Baker, and Solomon. Visitors can read the official accounts, see the weapons, understand what these men faced. Troy, New York, maintains the memorial to O'Brien, Baker, and Ross. The city hasn't forgotten. Every Memorial Day, veterans gather there, lay wreaths, honor the men who left Troy and never came home. The memorial includes detailed plaques explaining what happened on Saipan, how 3 men from one city earned 3 medals of honor in one battle. The National World War II Museum in New Orleans has extensive Saipan exhibits. They include first-hand accounts from survivors of the bonsai charge, photographs of the aftermath, analysis of the tactics. One exhibit specifically focuses on the Jeep-mounted .50 caliber machine guns and their effectiveness against human wave attacks. But the most important memorial isn't in a museum. It's in the doctrine. It's in the training manuals at infantry school. It's in the lessons learned that saved lives at Yuima and Okinawa. O'Brien's sacrifice wasn't just heroic. It was instructive. Future soldiers learned from what he did, learned when to stand, when to fire, how to defend against suicidal attacks. If this story moved you the way it moved us, do me a favor, hit that like button. Every single like tells YouTube to show this story to more people. Hit subscribe and turn on notifications. We're rescuing forgotten stories from dusty archives every single day. Stories about soldiers who saved lives with courage and machine guns. Real people, real heroism. Drop a comment right now and tell us where you're watching from. Are you watching from the United States, United Kingdom, Canada, Australia? Our community stretches across the entire world. You're not just a viewer. You're part of keeping these memories alive. Tell us your location. Tell us if someone in your family served. Just let us know you're here. Thank you for watching, and thank you for making sure Lieutenant Colonel William O'Brien, Private Thomas Baker, and Captain Benjamin Solomon don't disappear into silence. These men deserve to be remembered, and you're helping make that